Something about the house felt wrong that night. The floor trembled beneath her bare feet, even though nearly 3 feet of earth and snow were pressing down on the roof above her. Helen woke to that low vibration traveling through the stone, subtle enough that nothing fell, nothing cracked, but strong enough to move through her bones. 6 months pregnant and alone, she pushed herself upright, one hand on her stomach, the other against the packed earth wall beside her bed. The roof wasn't above her. It was part of the mountain itself. The house had always been steady, warm in a way that didn't make sense for late autumn in the mountains. But tonight, that warmth felt tense, like it was holding its breath. Down in the valley, beyond the trees, a faint mechanical hum drifted upward. They had started drilling again. And Helen knew, the way you sometimes just know, that the mountain didn't like it. She wasn't afraid the house would collapse. She was afraid of what would happen if the mountain finally answered back. Because this wasn't an ordinary house built on top of land. It was built into it, shaped to listen. To understand why a pregnant woman was standing barefoot on a stone floor in the middle of the night, listening to her walls breathe, we have to go back to the day she lost everything. When her husband left, he didn't slam the door. He didn't shout, didn't throw accusations across the kitchen. He just stood there, keys in his hand, and said he couldn't do it anymore. Then he placed the keys on the counter, like he was setting down something borrowed, not something shared, and walked out. Helen stayed where she was, one hand resting instinctively on the curve of her 6-month pregnant belly, the other gripping the back of a chair, as if the room had tilted slightly off balance. The quiet felt organized, almost deliberate, and that frightened her more than anger would have. The silence afterward was worse than any argument. It wasn't dramatic. It was clean, almost polite. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Ordinary sounds in a life that had just split in two. She had done what she thought you were supposed to do. She built a steady life, married a steady man, kept her expectations reasonable. They weren't loud people. They didn't fight much. They didn't dream extravagantly either, but she had believed in the shape of their future. A small nursery painted in soft colors, a crib near the window, winter mornings with coffee and a baby wrapped in blankets. Now the nursery felt like a room she wasn't sure she was allowed to enter. The first night alone, she slept on one side of the bed without meaning to. By morning, her body ached from the tension she hadn't realized she was holding. She lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how something could unravel so quietly. There had been no betrayal she could point to, no explosion that justified the ending, just exhaustion on his face and the decision to leave. In the days that followed, practical things moved faster than her thoughts. Bills, phone calls, a lease that suddenly felt too large for one income. She caught herself calculating how long she could stay before she would have to make another decision. Winter was coming. The air had already sharpened at the edges. She found herself worrying about heat, about rent, about how she would manage appointments and groceries with a newborn in the snow. She didn't cry much in those first few days. Instead, she functioned. She packed away his clothes into boxes he said he would collect later. She folded baby onesies and stacked them neatly in drawers. She kept telling herself she would figure it out. People did this all the time. Women raised children alone. It wasn't the end of the world. But at night, when the house settled into its familiar creaks, she felt something else. Not anger, not even panic. A kind of weight pressing gently against her chest. It wasn't just that she had been left. It was that she no longer recognized the shape of her own life. The letter arrived on a gray afternoon when she was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through paperwork she barely understood. The envelope was thick and official, addressed in a careful, unfamiliar hand. She almost didn't open it. She assumed it was another notice, another obligation. Instead, it was a message from a county records office several hours north, in a part of the state she hadn't visited in years. Her grandmother's name was printed in bold type, Margaret Wells. The letter informed her that a property had been transferred into her name, a house, located in the mountains. She hadn't thought about that house in years. Now it was the only place that didn't feel closed to her. Helen read the sentence twice, as if it might rearrange itself into something more sensible. A house. Not a savings account. Not a parcel of land in town. A house she had nearly forgotten existed. She hadn't been there since she was a child. Her memories of it were fragments. The smell of wood smoke. The crunch of frost under boots too big for her small feet. Her grandmother's hands steady and warm as they wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. She remembered the house feeling different from others, quieter somehow, as if it belonged to the mountain instead of sitting on top of it. She had never thought of it as something she would inherit. It had always felt like it would outlast everyone. The letter didn't describe the structure in detail. It listed coordinates, acreage, transfer dates. Legal language, clean and impersonal. But the word house pulsed on the page as if it carried more than walls and a roof. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it. The mountains in late fall, the isolation, the cold. She was pregnant. She needed doctors nearby, grocery stores, cell service. The idea was impractical, almost reckless. And yet, she looked around the kitchen that no longer felt like hers, at the boxes stacked by the door, at the second chair across from her that would remain empty. Staying suddenly felt heavier than leaving. That night she lay awake and let herself remember more clearly. The house had been built into the slope, not perched above it. She recalled running her hand along a wall that felt cool and solid, packed earth reinforced with timber beams darkened by time. She remembered how warm it had felt inside, even when frost clung to the grass outside. Not heated in the way city homes were heated, with vents and rattling radiators. The warmth had seemed to rise from the walls themselves, slow and steady. As a child, she hadn't questioned it. Now, the memory returned with a sharper edge. Why had it felt so stable, so sheltered? She remembered her grandmother once placing her palm flat against the wall and saying, almost absently, "If you build with the land, it holds you." At the time, Helen had assumed it was just something old people said. In the small hours of the morning, she sat up in bed and turned on the lamp. The decision formed quietly, without drama. She would go north. She told herself it was temporary, just until she figured things out, just until the baby was born. She didn't frame it as escape. She framed it as practicality. A house already paid for, land that didn't demand rent. But beneath the logic, something else stirred. A pull she couldn't fully name. Staying suddenly felt heavier than leaving. 2 weeks later, she loaded her car with what she could carry. Clothes, blankets, a few boxes of baby supplies. She paused in the doorway of the apartment, hand on her stomach, and let herself feel the weight of what she was leaving. Not just a man, a version of herself who had believed safety came from shared plans. The drive north was longer than she remembered. She didn't know if she was driving toward shelter or towards something that would test her even more. Highways gave way to smaller roads, then narrower ones lined with trees that leaned inward as if closing ranks. The air grew colder. Her phone signal flickered, then disappeared entirely. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel and kept going. There were moments when doubt surged. What if the house was unlivable? What if it had deteriorated beyond repair? What if memory had exaggerated its stability, its warmth? She pictured arriving to find a sagging roof, broken windows, damp floors. But she also remembered the way it had seemed to disappear into the hillside, as if the mountain itself had decided to keep it. She remembered the quiet inside, not empty, but contained. As the road curved upward and gravel replaced pavement, she felt the baby shift inside her, a small, insistent movement. She rested one hand briefly against her belly and whispered that she was trying. She didn't know if she was driving toward refuge or toward another mistake. She only knew she couldn't stay where she had been left. When she finally turned onto the last stretch of narrow path leading toward the property, the trees thickened and the sky above seemed smaller. She slowed the car, heart pounding harder than the incline justified. Whatever waited beyond the bend would decide more than just where she slept that night. And as the outline of the hillside began to change ahead of her, she realized she was about to see whether the house she remembered, built into the mountain, steady and warm against the cold, was still there, waiting. At first, she almost drove past it. The hillside looked unbroken, a sweep of late autumn grass and scattered stone rising into trees. It wasn't until she slowed to a crawl that the shape began to separate itself from the land. A darker line where timber met earth. A narrow strip of window set low against the slope. The roof wasn't a roof in the way she expected. It was grass and soil continuing upward, as if the mountain had simply folded over and left a seam. If she hadn't known it was there, she would have missed it entirely. Helen turned off the engine and sat still. The air outside carried that thin, metallic cold that comes before the first hard frost. She stepped out carefully, one hand braced against the car door, the other resting on her belly. Gravel shifted under her boots. The house did not loom. It did not announce itself. It settled into the hillside with a kind of patience that made her feel like the visitor. Up close, the walls were thick timber beams set against compacted earth, the wood darkened by decades of weather. The front door was solid and plain, no decorative trim, no wide porch. Just a heavy handle, worn smooth by hands that had used it often. She hesitated before turning it. Inside, the first thing she noticed wasn't sight. It was sensation. The air didn't bite. Outside, the wind moved sharply through the trees, but here, the cold softened into something steady. Not warm in the way a furnace blasts heat through vents. There was no hum of machinery, no metallic rattle. The temperature felt even, like stepping into a room that had been breathing slowly all day. She closed the door behind her and waited for the damp smell of abandonment. Instead, she caught the scent of earth and dry wood. Clean, grounded. The floor beneath her feet was stone, laid in irregular shapes but fitted tightly together. When she shifted her weight, nothing creaked. Light entered through narrow windows set deep into the walls, angled so that it washed across the interior without exposing it fully. The rooms did not rise upward toward a ceiling. They stepped back into the mountain. One level flowed into the next, descending slightly, as though each space had been carved with care rather than stacked. It felt less like entering a building, and more like being received into something that had been waiting. She moved slowly, palm grazing the wall as she walked. The surface was cool but not cold, dense. She pressed her hand flat against it and felt a faint, almost imperceptible steadiness. Not vibration, not movement, just a sense of stored weight. In the main room, a long bench had been built directly into the wall, the timber frame blending seamlessly into packed earth. She lowered herself onto it, breathing harder than she expected. The drive, the pregnancy, the quiet shock of seeing the house still intact, it all pressed against her at once. The silence inside wasn't empty. It was contained. Outside, wind brushed through the trees in restless bursts. Inside, the sound softened, filtered through layers of soil and wood, until it became something like a distant murmur. The house didn't block the world, it absorbed it. She stood and explored further. A small kitchen area with a wide stone counter, shelving carved into thick walls. A narrow corridor leading upward, where the air felt slightly warmer with each step. She paused midway, noticing the difference. It wasn't dramatic, just subtle enough to register against her skin. She looked up and saw a narrow vent cut high along the inner wall, barely visible. Another opening near the floor on the lower level. She crouched carefully, running her fingers along the edge. No ductwork, no metal grates, just deliberate gaps angled upward. The realization came slowly. The house wasn't trapping heat the way modern homes did. It was guiding it. Warm air rising naturally through channels built into the structure. Cooler air settling lower. The thick earth walls absorbing warmth during the day and releasing it gradually after sunset. No switches, no settings to adjust. As a child, she had thought it was magic. Now, standing there with adult eyes, she saw intention. She found the bedroom space toward the middle tier, where the air felt most balanced. Not the warmest, not the coolest, just steady. A small window set deep into the wall offered a narrow view of the slope outside. From here, the mountain didn't feel like something looming. It felt close, almost protective. Helen set her bags down and walked back to the main room. On a shelf near the far wall, tucked behind a stack of folded linens, she noticed a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The fabric was stiff with age, but carefully tied. She untied it with slow fingers. Inside were papers, thick sheets, edges yellowed but intact. Hand-drawn lines, measurements. Cross-sections of the house sketched with precision. Arrows indicating air movement. Notes written in her grandmother's small, controlled handwriting. Helen sat at the table and spread the pages out. There were diagrams of the hillside itself, contour lines showing how the slope carried rainwater away from the foundation, calculations of wall thickness and stone density, observations about how long the interior retained warmth after a day of sunlight. Not vague impressions, but recorded numbers, dates, seasonal comparisons. Her grandmother hadn't simply built a quiet retreat in the mountains. She had studied the mountain. One page showed a side view of the structure embedded into the slope. The roof layer was marked as soil and vegetation, thick enough to insulate but graded to shed water. Beneath it, a reinforced timber frame angled slightly inward, distributing weight toward the earth instead of resisting it outward. The stone floor rested on a base designed to shift minimally without cracking. Another page detailed airflow paths. Small shafts carved into interior walls, hidden from sight, creating a slow upward current. Helen traced the lines with her finger, imagining the invisible movement happening around her at that very moment. The house was not defying the mountain, it was cooperating with it. A memory surfaced, clearer now. her grandmother once crouching beside her, pressing Helen's small hand against the wall. "Feel that?" she had asked. Helen had shrugged. "It doesn't fight," her grandmother said softly. "That's why it lasts." At the time, Helen had thought she meant arguments. Now she understood she had meant pressure. Wind, snow, the subtle shifting of ground over years. She stood and walked to the lowest level, moving carefully. The air there felt cooler but heavier, grounded. She placed her palm against the stone floor and imagined the weight of the mountain pressing gently above, the structure channeling that weight sideways instead of absorbing it directly. It wasn't fragile. It wasn't rigid. It was responsive. For the first time since arriving, Helen felt something shift inside her. Not relief, exactly. More like recognition. The house wasn't grand, it wasn't luxurious, but it was deliberate. Every angle and thickness had been chosen for a reason. Outside, a gust of wind pushed harder against the hillside. She waited for a creak, a groan, some sign of strain. Nothing came. The sound dulled, dispersed. The air inside remained even. The walls held. She realized then that this place was more than shelter from rent or winter. It was proof of a way of building, and maybe a way of living, that didn't require constant force to survive. She gathered the papers carefully and stacked them back together, though she kept one sheet out, studying the cross-section of the house embedded in the mountain's curve. She wondered how many people would look at this structure and see only dirt and wood. How many would miss the design entirely because it did not demand attention. As evening settled, light thinned through the narrow windows, and the interior deepened into shadow without growing cold. She lit a small lamp and sat at the table, the diagram beside her. Outside, somewhere far down the slope, a faint sound carried upward. Not wind this time. A low mechanical hum, barely there, but distinct against the quiet. Helen lifted her head and listened more carefully. The house did not react. It remained steady, breathing in its slow, unseen way. But the mountain, she sensed, had begun to receive something new. The machines arrived 3 days later. At first it was just a sound that didn't belong. A low mechanical thrum rising from the valley in uneven intervals, too steady to be wind, too rhythmic to be wildlife. Helen was standing near the narrow kitchen window when she heard it. The house felt as it always did, balanced, quiet, but the air beyond the glass carried something sharper. She stepped outside and followed the slope down just far enough to see through the trees. 2 trucks crawled along a rough access road that hadn't been there before. Bright survey flags dotted the ground in small, deliberate lines. Men in reflective vests moved methodically, planting markers into soil that had likely never been measured. They weren't on her immediate patch of land. Not yet. But they were close enough that the sound reached the walls. When one of the men noticed her watching, he raised a hand in acknowledgement, then continued working. It was the kind of polite dismissal that assumed cooperation. Helen stayed where she was for a moment longer, one hand pressed lightly against her stomach, feeling the baby shift. By afternoon, a man in a hard hat walked up the slope toward her property line. He moved with the confidence of someone used to being welcomed, or at least tolerated. "Ma'am," he called out, stopping a respectful distance away. "We're conducting a standard geological survey in this area, just preliminary testing." His tone was calm, practiced. The words landed cleanly, but something about them felt unfinished. "What kind of testing?" she asked. "Core samples, ground stability. Nothing invasive at this stage." Nothing invasive. Helen thought of the diagrams spread across her table. The cross-sections showing how the hillside carried weight, the notes about pressure zones and fault pockets where the soil shifted subtly with seasonal moisture. Her grandmother had mapped the mountain not as territory, but as a living slope that redistributed stress through layers. "These hills aren't as solid as they look," Helen said carefully. "They move." He gave a small smile. "We've run the data." She nodded once, not arguing. So had the people who built that house. His eyes flicked toward the structure behind her, partially hidden by the rise of earth. From where he stood, it likely looked unremarkable. Timber, dirt, a roof that blended into grass. "We're not here to cause problems," he added. "Just gathering information." Information. The word lingered. That evening, the hum continued longer than it had in the morning. Helen moved through the house slowly, noticing what she had begun to recognize as subtle patterns. The lower level felt denser, the air settling heavier against her skin. The middle tier remained steady, the warmth rising in a gradual current through the hidden channels carved decades ago. She crouched near one of the narrow vents set close to the floor. The airflow felt unchanged, but her awareness of it had sharpened. The house worked quietly, distributing temperature and weight through deliberate pathways. It did not brace rigidly against the mountain. It leaned into it. After sunset, the first tremor came. It wasn't dramatic. No dishes rattled. No cracks split open in the walls. It was more like a deep vibration, passing through the stone floor in a slow wave. Helen was sitting at the table when she felt it. Her glass of water rippled slightly, a faint ring against the wood. She held her breath. The house did not shudder. Instead, she sensed a redistribution, as if the structure absorbed the movement and directed it outward. The walls felt firm under her palm, the temperature unchanged. But the tremor had not come from within. It came from below. The next morning, she walked down toward the worksite before the crews had fully assembled. The soil near the markers looked freshly disturbed, darker than the surrounding ground. A piece of drilling equipment stood upright like a needle, thin but purposeful. A different supervisor approached her this time, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, we're authorized for this section. If you have concerns, you'll need to contact the county office." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet, one of her grandmother's diagrams, copied the night before. It showed the hillside in layers, highlighting a section where pressure converged near the base. "This area here," she said, pointing. "It's a natural convergence point. Water channels through it in heavy rain. The soil compresses." He glanced at the paper briefly. "With respect, that's not an official survey." "No," she replied evenly. "It's older." He handed the page back without comment. By afternoon, clouds gathered low and gray, pressing down on the ridge. The air thickened with the kind of stillness that precedes heavy rain. Helen stood in the doorway of the house and watched as the first drops darkened the slope. Rain came quickly, soaking the hillside in a steady sheet. Water carved thin, temporary paths through the soil, following invisible lines etched over decades. Helen remembered a note from the journals describing how runoff altered surface tension in specific zones. Then she heard it. A sharp crack. Not thunder. Closer, immediate. Shouts rose from the valley. She moved as quickly as her body allowed, heart pounding against the rhythm of the rain. At the edge of the worksite, she saw one of the machines tilted at an unnatural angle. The ground beneath it had slumped, creating a shallow sinkhole that swallowed part of its base. Men scrambled to stabilize the equipment. Mud slid in slow sheets, not catastrophic, but decisive. Helen's gaze traveled upward along the slope, tracing the line where the soil had given way. It matched the contour marked in the diagram almost exactly. The supervisor spotted her, rain dripping from his hard hat. "Ma'am, please step back." "This isn't random," she said, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the rain. "You're drilling into a compression pocket." "We've assessed the area." She shook her head. "You assessed what's easy to measure." He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the tilted machinery. Work paused that day. That night, the house felt different. Not unstable, not threatened, but attentive. Helen descended to the lowest level, where the air remained cool and grounded. She ran her hand along the packed earth wall and stopped when she felt a faint warmth concentrated in one narrow section. A hairline crack had formed along the surface, thin but unmistakable. She didn't panic. Instead, she watched. The crack did not widen. It held steady, as if marking a boundary rather than breaking one. The warmth near it pulsed subtly, then evened out. The structure was adjusting, distributing pressure through its internal frame and dense walls. It wasn't fighting the disturbance, it was responding to it. Helen pressed her palm flat against the stone floor and closed her eyes. The mountain had shifted, and the house had absorbed the message. Not with noise, but with calibration. Upstairs, wind moved through the trees again, lighter now after the storm. The mechanical hum had ceased for the evening. She climbed back to the middle tier and sat on the built-in bench, breathing slowly. The baby shifted inside her, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this calculation. Tomorrow, the crews would return. The flags would still stand. The question would remain whether they would listen to what the ground had already said. Helen looked toward the table where the diagrams lay stacked. For the first time since the machines arrived, she understood that staying silent would not protect the house, or the slope it leaned into. And in the quiet that followed the storm, she began to consider what it would mean to step forward, instead of simply standing her ground. The next morning, Helen didn't wait for the machines to start. She stood at the edge of the access road before the first truck rounded the bend, a folder tucked under her arm, the cold air settling low against the slope. She could feel the weight of the mountain behind her, not as pressure, but as presence. The house, partially hidden in the rise of earth, looked unchanged, grass still thick along the roofline, narrow windows dark against timber. It gave nothing away. The supervisor from the day before stepped out of his vehicle and paused when he saw her. "Ma'am," he began, already weary, "we can't have you interfering with operations." "I'm not interfering," she said. "I'm asking you to look." She handed him copies of the diagrams, the sections her grandmother had drawn decades ago, cross-sections of the slope, notes about water runoff and compression zones, arrows marking where weight shifted naturally after heavy rain. He flipped through them with polite skepticism. "You understand these aren't certified reports?" "No," she replied evenly. "They're older than your reports." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Workers moved around them, slower than usual, glancing toward the tilted machine that still sat partially sunken in yesterday's mud. "You don't have credentials in geology," he said finally. She shook her head. "No." "You're not an engineer?" "No." He closed the folder halfway. "Then on what basis are you asking us to stop?" Helen didn't raise her voice. "On the basis that the house behind me has been standing inside this slope for over 40 years without cracking. And it was built according to what's in those pages." He followed her gaze toward the structure. From here, the design was clearer, the way the roof disappeared into the hillside instead of cutting sharply against it,
the way the front wall angled slightly inward rather than pushing outward against gravity. "It's not built on top of the mountain," she continued. "It's built with it. The walls aren't resisting weight. They're distributing it." He studied the roofline more closely now, noticing how soil and vegetation extended seamlessly over timber. Not decorative landscaping, but insulation and anchoring combined.
The foundation wasn't exposed concrete. It was layered stone resting on compacted earth, designed to settle incrementally without fracturing. "The crack in the lower wall didn't widen," she added quietly. "It marked a shift. Then it stabilized." He looked back at her, expression tightening. "You've seen structural damage?" "A hairline adjustment," she corrected. "After your first drilling run." That detail held him longer than anything else she had said. Work resumed that day, but slower. Engineers knelt beside equipment, rechecking levels. Measurements were taken twice. Conversations grew more technical, less dismissive. Helen returned to the house and waited. One of the engineers stepped back and looked at the hillside again. "Do you realize," he said quietly, "this roof isn't just insulated, it's anchored by the mountain itself." He tapped the inward-leaning beam with his knuckles. "Most homes resist pressure. This one transfers it back into the slope." For the first time, someone with credentials was saying out loud what the house had been proving all winter. Waiting felt different now. She moved through the rooms with sharper attention. The airflow channels along the inner walls carried warmth upward in their usual steady pattern. The stone floor remained even underfoot. In the lower level, the thin crack remained visible but unchanged, the surrounding earth firm. She placed a small chalk mark beside it, not as a warning, but as a reference point. That afternoon, an email arrived through the one narrow stretch of signal she could catch near the upper window. A geologist from a nearby university had heard about the sinkhole incident. Someone had mentioned a structure built into the slope that had remained intact. He asked if he could see it. Helen hesitated only briefly before responding. She attached photographs of the house exterior, careful to show the integration of roof and hillside, the angle of the support beams. She scanned one of the airflow diagrams and included it as well. The reply came faster than she expected. "This predates modern passive earth-sheltered design," the message read. "Do you have documentation of the original build?" She looked at the stack of journals on the table. Handwritten entries tracking interior temperature against outdoor conditions. Notes on how long the walls retained daytime warmth after sunset. Observations about how snow accumulated on the roof without compromising insulation. Her grandmother had documented everything. 2 days later, the geologist arrived with a colleague. They walked slowly around the structure, crouching to examine the seam where timber met soil. One of them pressed his hand against the wall and stood still, eyes closed, as if listening through his palm. Inside, they traced the airflow paths Helen had discovered, following the subtle temperature shift from lower level to middle tier. They knelt by the chalk-marked crack and measured its width. "It's not spreading," one murmured. "No," Helen said. It adjusted. The word felt right. Later that evening, as the researchers left, the supervisor returned alone. He stood near the doorway, hat in his hands. "Corporate's reviewing the incident," he said. "There's talk of a temporary suspension until further assessment." Helen nodded, not allowing relief to surface too quickly. "You understand," he added. "This isn't because of sentiment. It's liability." "I understand," she said. He glanced once more at the interior, at the thick earth walls and stone floor that bore no visible strain. "You built this?" he asked. "My grandmother did."
He gave a short nod, then turned back down the slope. In the quiet that followed, Helen remained standing in the doorway longer than she needed to. The mountain felt still, but not passive.
The house seemed almost neutral, as if this moment required no celebration. Inside, she spread the journals across the table again. Between the measurements and sketches, she noticed smaller notes she had overlooked before. Lines written in the margins. Snowpack heavy this year, walls held steady. Rainfall above average, no seepage along east seam. And one sentence underlined twice. There is a difference between resisting force and absorbing it. Helen read that line slowly. All her life, she had believed strength meant holding firm, not bending. In her marriage, she had absorbed discomfort quietly, assuming endurance was the same as stability. Now she was beginning to see another model in front of her. She had seen what that looked like in real life. Thick earth walls holding a day's sunlight. Timber beams leaning inward so snow didn't split them apart. The house did not stand rigid against pressure. It accepted it, redistributed it, and returned to equilibrium. The emails increased over the next week. A regional planner asked for documentation. An environmental nonprofit inquired about historical designation. None of them addressed her as an expert. They called her the property owner. She didn't correct them. She simply answered what she knew, shared what she had, and admitted when she didn't understand something. The absence of credentials no longer felt like a weakness. It felt honest. One evening, as she sat near the middle-tier window, she noticed how naturally she had begun to move within the structure. She chose the warmest corridor in the early morning, the densest room during wind. She trusted the house's rhythm. Outside, the trucks were fewer now. Conversations in the valley were shorter. The bright survey flags remained, but they no longer multiplied. Helen rested both hands on her belly and felt the steady movement beneath her palms. The baby was heavier now, her center of gravity shifting with each step. The largest test ahead would not come from drilling equipment or official reviews. It would come from her own body. And as winter edged closer along the ridge, she understood that the house would soon be asked to hold more than data and diagrams. It would be asked to hold her. Winter did not arrive all at once. It settled in layers. The first heavy snow fell overnight, softening the edges of the ridge and muting the valley below until the access road disappeared entirely. By morning, the house was nearly invisible from a distance. The roof, already an extension of the hillside, vanished under white, blending so completely into the slope that it looked as though the mountain had simply grown thicker. Inside, nothing felt abrupt. The temperature along the middle tier held steady, just as her grandmother's notes had described. Helen tested it herself with a small thermometer she had brought from town. Outside, the air hovered well below freezing. Inside, the stone floor on the lower level felt cool under her palm, but not biting. The walls along the main room carried a slow, even warmth that deepened after midday, when pale sunlight slipped through the narrow windows and struck the dense earth at an angle. There was no blast of heat, no rush of artificial air. Instead, the warmth seemed to rise from the structure itself, absorbed into the thick walls during the brighter hours, and released gradually once the light faded. The airflow channels, those narrow, nearly invisible shafts carved decades ago, continued their quiet work, drawing cooler air downward and allowing warmer currents to climb toward the sleeping area. The house did not fight the cold. It moderated it. By late December, the road remained iced over. Trucks had stopped coming entirely. The survey flags down in the valley were half buried in snow, small splashes of color fading against white. Helen's movements slowed with her body. She measured her days not by clocks, but by light. Morning brightness filtering through the east-facing slit of window. Afternoon glow warming the middle corridor. Early darkness pooling near the lower level. The baby shifted frequently now, strong and insistent. Helen spoke softly as she moved through the rooms, her voice absorbed gently by the thick walls. Sometimes she placed her palm flat against the packed earth and felt the faint temperature gradient beneath it. Cooler near the base, warmer higher up. Proof of the internal balance at work. One night, the wind intensified without warning. It swept across the ridge in sharp gusts that would have rattled a traditional roofline. Snow drifted hard against the hillside. Helen lay awake, listening. The house did not creak. Wind pressed against the slope, but the roof, layered in soil and vegetation beneath the snow, offered no edge for it to catch. The weight of accumulated snow did not strain beams. It distributed downward into the hillside itself. The inward angled supports redirected that weight into the mountain rather than resisting it outward. Helen sat up slowly and moved to the main room. She ran her hand along the wall, feeling not for damage, but for tension. The surface remained firm and steady. The airflow continued in its slow current. The house had absorbed the storm without protest. She whispered thank you, though she wasn't sure whether she meant it for the structure or for the woman who had designed it. The first contraction came just before dawn on a day when the sky was clear and painfully bright against snow. At first, it felt like a tightening she could ignore. She stood by the narrow window, watching sunlight stretch thinly across the slope, and told herself it was nothing. But when the second wave followed, deeper and more deliberate, she set the kettle aside and braced her hands against the stone counter. The house was quiet. No vehicles, no distant hum. Only the faint sound of wind brushing against the trees. She moved carefully toward the middle tier, the space she had come to understand as the most stable in temperature and airflow. The lower level remained cooler, dense and grounded. The upper corridor warmed more quickly during the day, but lost heat faster at night. The middle held steady, buffered by earth on three sides and positioned directly within the upward current of warm air. She lowered herself onto the built-in bench, breathing slowly. Another contraction came, stronger. The reality settled without panic. The road was impassable. There would be no quick drive to town, no sterile hospital room. The house would hold this moment. Helen had prepared quietly in the weeks before, reading, setting aside clean linens, boiling water and storing it in insulated containers. She had studied her grandmother's notes not just about airflow and insulation, but about how the structure responded to extended cold. How long it took for interior temperatures to drop if sunlight failed. How heat concentrated near the inner walls. Now she relied on that knowledge. She spread blankets near the thickest interior wall, where the earth mass behind it retained the previous day's warmth. She adjusted a small lantern so its glow would not flicker in drafts. There were none. The air moved gently but consistently, rising past her shoulder and dispersing toward the upper level. Time shifted. Contractions came in waves, each one pulling her inward. She gripped the edge of the bench, then the packed earth wall, feeling its solid resistance beneath her palm. The surface did not tremble. It grounded her. Hours passed, marked only by the angle of light narrowing across the floor. At one point, she leaned back and closed her eyes, pressing her hand flat against the stone beside her. The floor felt cool but stable, the same coolness she had felt on her first night here. Never punishing, never brittle. The house seemed to contract and release with her, not in movement, but in atmosphere. Warm air gathered steadily around her upper body, drawn upward through the hidden channels. The temperature did not spike. It did not drop. it held. Fear flickered at the edges of her thoughts. She let it move through without chasing it. The walls had endured wind and weight. The slope had adjusted after drilling. The crack along the lower level had stabilized without widening. She focused on rhythm. When the pain intensified, she shifted closer to the interior seam where two thick walls met. That corner retained warmth longest, as she had measured during early winter nights. The dense earth behind it released stored heat slowly, like a banked fire without flame. She knelt there now, breathing, hands braced against timber beams that had once been set carefully at a slight inward angle to redirect load. They felt solid, unwavering. Outside, sunlight faded toward late afternoon. The sky shifted from white glare to pale gray. Inside, the transition was gradual. The interior light softened without plunging into sudden cold. The house seemed to anticipate darkness, releasing the warmth it had absorbed earlier. By the time true night settled over the ridge, Helen was on the floor, wrapped in blankets, her back against the packed earth wall. There were moments when she doubted her strength, when the isolation pressed hard against her ribs. But each time she lifted her head, she saw the narrow window set deep into the wall, snow glowing faintly beyond it, and she felt enclosed rather than exposed. The final contraction came like a wave cresting after a long tide. Then there was a sound she had never heard before in that house, a small, sharp cry. Helen collapsed backward onto the blankets, breath leaving her in a rush she hadn't realized she was holding. She lifted the baby, small, warm, slick with newness, against her chest. The air around them remained steady, neither harsh nor stifling. She had given birth inside a house designed to survive the mountain, and it had survived with her. She wrapped the child in prepared linens and held her close to the inner wall. The warmth radiating from the dense earth felt almost intentional, as though the house had reserved it for this moment. Snow continued to fall outside, but no wind cut through. No draft slipped along the floor. The airflow channels maintained their quiet circulation, preventing the air from growing stale or damp. Helen counted tiny breaths against her collarbone. The house did not celebrate. It did not change. It simply held them. Dawn arrived pale and slow, light filtering through the narrow windows and stretching across stone. The temperature remained within the same narrow range she had come to trust. The structure had absorbed the longest night of winter and released its stored warmth exactly as designed. Helen looked down at her daughter and felt a stillness deeper than exhaustion. She had come to this mountain because she had nowhere else to go. Now she understood that she had arrived in a place built not just to shelter, but to endure. The house, embedded into the slope, had proven something no document or official review could measure. It could sustain life. And as morning settled fully over the ridge, Helen realized that the next season would not be about survival alone. It would be about what she chose to do with what had been preserved. By early spring, the snow began to recede in uneven patches along the slope, revealing the roofline of the house as if it were emerging slowly from sleep. As the snow melted, water didn't pool or seep into cracks. It followed the graded curve of the roof, sliding naturally down the hillside, exactly as Margaret had drawn decades ago. The house didn't need gutters. The mountain carried the runoff for it. Grass pressed flat beneath months of weight lifted itself again. From a distance, the structure returned to its familiar outline, half hidden, half held by the mountain. Inside, life had narrowed into smaller rhythms. Clara slept in the middle tier, where the temperature remained most stable, her cradle positioned near the interior wall that released warmth long after sunset. Helen had tested the range repeatedly through winter, placing a thermometer at different heights and corners. The difference between the lower level and the upper corridor could shift by several degrees within hours, but the middle held steady within a narrow band, buffered by dense earth on three sides and the upward current from the airflow channels. The house had not faltered once. Emails continued to arrive, though less urgently now. The temporary suspension of drilling had become formal. Engineers had returned for independent assessments, walking the slope with new caution. They measured soil density, runoff patterns, and ground movement with equipment far more sophisticated than anything Margaret Wells had owned. Yet their findings echoed her handwritten notes. The hillside redistributed stress along natural seams. Heavy intrusion near convergence points increased instability. What they were preserving wasn't just timber and stone. It was a blueprint for building into land instead of against it. Walls thick enough to store a day's sunlight. Air channels carved so precisely that the house breathed without wires or switches. A proposal surfaced quietly. Designation as a protected site of technical and historical significance. Not a museum, not a landmark for tourists. A working example of long-term Earth-integrated design. Helen read the draft while Clara slept against her chest. The language was precise, careful. It described the structure as an early model of passive earth sheltering, notable for its integration with slope dynamics and thermal mass regulation. It mentioned airflow shafts carved into interior walls, roof layering that combined insulation with load transfer, stone flooring set to accommodate incremental settlement without fracture. It did not mention her by name, beyond property owner. She found that she preferred it that way. Researchers began to visit in small numbers, never crowding the space. They moved through the rooms quietly, running their hands along the packed earth, crouching beside the lower-level seam where the thin crack had stabilized months ago. They measured interior temperatures at different times of day and compared them to exterior readings. The data confirmed what Helen had lived through. The walls absorbed daytime solar gain through the narrow, angled windows and released it gradually across the night. Airflow channels maintained circulation without mechanical assistance. The inward-leaning timber supports transferred roof load into the hillside rather than outward against it. The house was not innovative in the flashy sense. It was patient. Helen found herself answering questions without rushing. She described how the wind sounded different inside during winter storms, muted, diffused by layers of soil overhead. She explained how snow accumulation on the roof did not threaten collapse, but increased insulation, pressing downward into a structure designed to distribute that weight into the mountain's mass. She did not embellish. When she didn't know something, she said so. Clara grew stronger in the same rooms that had held her first breath. Helen watched how light shifted across the stone floor in spring, warming one section longer each afternoon as the sun's angle changed. She adjusted their routine accordingly, placing a blanket in that patch of sunlight for Clara's midday rest. The house taught through observation, not instruction. One evening, Laura, the county inspector who had first questioned the structure, returned to review final paperwork. She stood in the main room, arms folded, studying the interior with a different expression than before. "It's rare," she said finally, "to see something this old perform better than what we build now." Helen looked at the thick wall beside them. "It wasn't built to impress anyone." Laura nodded. "That might be the point." After she left, Helen remained by the doorway, Clara balanced against her shoulder. The valley below looked unchanged, but the bright survey flags were gone. No trucks, no machinery. only the faint outline of the access road cutting through new grass. The house had not won a battle. It had endured one. That difference mattered. In the months that followed, Helen noticed a shift inside herself that mirrored the structure around her. She no longer braced for sudden collapse. She no longer equated silence with weakness. The house had shown her another pattern. Absorb what you can, redirect what you must, return to balance. She thought often about the life she had left behind. Not with resentment, with clarity. She had once believed that security meant shared plans and predictable outcomes. Now she understood it could also mean alignment, with land, with design, with her own judgment. Clara stirred, small fingers curling into Helen's sweater. Helen pressed her palm against the interior wall, feeling the faint residual warmth from the afternoon sun. This was what she had been given. Not just shelter, not just protection from winter. A model. The house demonstrated that strength did not require constant force. It required attention, adjustment, respect for underlying structure. Outside, wind moved lightly through the trees, no longer harsh. The roof, layered in soil and living grass, blended seamlessly into the hillside once more. Helen did not think of herself as a guardian or a symbol. She was a mother who had chosen to stay. The inheritance she had received was not merely a piece of property embedded in a mountain. It was a way of standing without resisting everything that pressed against you. And as spring settled fully across the ridge, she understood that what she would build next, for her daughter, for herself, would follow the same design. Months later, the floor trembled once more, softer this time. And once again, the house didn't resist. It absorbed, redistributed, and held. On that first night, when Helen woke to the low vibration beneath the stone floor, she thought something was wrong. The floor had trembled, yes, but the walls had shifted their weight, the beams had leaned inward, and the warmth inside never broke. The house adjusted instead of collapsing. And in a way, something was. The mountain was being disturbed. Her life had already been disturbed, but what she didn't know yet was that she was standing inside something built not to panic under pressure, but to respond to it. That house carved into the hillside, roof covered in soil, walls packed with earth, hidden channels guiding warm air upward, was never meant to fight the mountain. It was designed to listen to it. And because it listened, it lasted. Helen came there because she had been left. She stayed because she discovered that strength doesn't always look like pushing back. Sometimes it looks like absorbing what you can, redistributing what you must, and holding steady long enough for things to settle. The same walls that moderated winter cold, the same inward-leaning beams that carried the weight of snow into the slope, held her through labor, through doubt, through the quiet work of becoming a mother on her own. That's the part that makes this story worth staying for. Not the suspension notice, not the officials, but the realization that what saved her wasn't rescue. It was design. Patient, grounded, intentional design. Maybe you're not living in a house built into a mountain, but maybe you're carrying more weight than you expected. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear what part stayed with you. And if you want more stories about ordinary people finding steady ground in unexpected places, you're welcome to stay a while. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is what that house did all along. Stay rooted, adjust quietly, and keep holding.